Welcome again, listeners, to the Washington Babylon podcast with Ken Silverstein. This week, Ken is on assignment in parts unknown, so I, Andrew Stewart, am bringing you two interviews. First up, I am speaking with the legendary labor historian and activist Paul Buhle, a man responsible for many fabulous books and graphic novels, as well as the extremely important oral history of the American left, an archive of radical testimony now available to listen to on SoundCloud. Then I am speaking with the farm and gardening author Kollibri terre Sonnenblume about the ever-important topic of our food supply and agricultural systems.
So, Paul, we've seen an upsurge of interest and subscription to socialism in the past now 5 years because of the Sanders campaign, and I'm interested in a conversation about organizing and how parties like the socialists and the communists in similar economic landscapes like we're seeing now because of this COVID depression, what their methods were like. And I was wondering what your thoughts were.
Here I thought you might ask me about the peculiar political history of Rhode Island and how that might fit into the jigsaw puzzle. Someone either grumpily or ironically had a letter in the New York Times this morning asking if Bernie Sanders had been invited into the editorial board. And that irony was based on hitherto unimaginable proposals from the editorial board and from op-ed writers and so forth, suggesting things like a guaranteed annual wage and other measures that would have been met with wild rage such a short time ago. And the reason is that the sense of crisis, the sense of how drastic the government response would have to be, presumably a future government, to salvage capitalism, to keep chaos and disorder from ruining business, among other things, is now very much in the conversation. I suppose the amazing thing is it's more in the conversation in the New York Times than around Joe Biden's immediate circle, where a mild shift to the left and otherwise, or in order to restore normality, seems to be remain the dominant thought. Well, this is a situation in which communists, if we go back as far as the 1930s, and socialists, if we were to go back to the 1910s or a decade earlier, could and did flourish because there's a sort of protective mechanism or border against the usual warnings about socialism being un-American and anything involving property rights being the holy of holies. So that it's a moment in which socialists, communists, and others who consider themselves in the left can make dramatic proposals, but also can organize on the ground with only a certain degree of fear that they're going to face waves of repression.
Gotcha. And the Communist Party and the Socialist Party both had substantial bases in Rhode Island, correct?
You might say that, but you would be exaggerating. Okay. Rhode Island had a very, very strong class sentiment. It used to be said that in order to recruit a scab, you had to find a swamp Yankee, because the industrial population, at least outside of South County, the industrial population was fairly comprehensively Catholic, and the owners of everything, except maybe in Woonsocket, where they were likely to be Parisian-based atheists, the factory population was Catholic, and the owners and the managers were Protestants. So that there was a natural hostility. It's also true that the owners tended to go all the way back to the families of slave owners, and the Catholics were immigrants from the Irish to the Italians and Jews to Azorians and others, not to mention African Americans and Cape Verdeans and those of mixed races, large in number. But to the degree that there was a left-wing influence, it was built on an ethnic basis. After all, James P. Reed was elected from an Irish ward in Olneyville to the state assembly one term in 1912, and the Communist Party was overwhelmingly first-generation immigrant, disproportionately Jewish, but any number of other groups with their own clubs. It's notable that at the high point of the Popular Front and World War II, the largest gathering that any group had was Armenian, a notably lower middle class, small merchant group that rallied almost across the entire population of Armenians, not all that numerous, to protect Armenia from the fascist menace. And to support the Soviet Union that was protecting them from the fascist menace. And if there were more recent currents, they were more likely to be Cape Verdeans, who had a strong influence from the shipping industry, workers in the shipping industry, and even more recent people from the islands off of Africa who were supporters of the PAIGC, and therefore rallied in very large numbers in Rhode Island in events, public events of all kinds. But like other ethnic groups with a heavy left influence, did so in languages that were unknown to the authorities by and large, and often behind closed doors of ethnic clubs. So that in order to protect themselves, even if the left very broadly considered not members of a party, I don't imagine that the CP had more than 75 members in Rhode Island, and I don't imagine the Socialist Party had more than a couple hundred members before 1920. But to the extent that influence was felt, it was felt in these quiet ways, and then expanded outwards through ethnic pressures, but also through unions and in any number of other ways, but quietly exerted. And incidentally, the same is true for the Socialist Party, which didn't lose its influence in Rhode Island until about 1940. It was an older and more middle-class group, but there was a very large workman circle with active North Main Street based, with very active clubs and wild enthusiasm for Norman Thomas when he came to Providence in 1932. One of my favorite stories on the communist side was me interviewing the man who ran for governor on the Communist Party ticket in 1932. He barely spoke English. He was an Armenian, and I said, "How did you come to be the candidate of the Communist Party in Rhode Island?" And he said, "I saw the Turks murder my parents, and Lenin was a strong man."
Gotcha.
He didn't need to say any more. That was it. So that when the populations increasingly assimilated in the 1940s and 1950s and 60s, this memory of the connection between the left and ethnic groups and unions tended to diminish, and in its place the always strong and conservative influence of the Catholic Church, maybe most of all the deeply reactionary French-Canadian Catholic Church, but also the Irish Catholic Church, exerted itself more formidably and made activities of the left in the labor movement necessarily even more secreted, more quiet, more under the name of militants rather than any words like socialism, revolution, or anti-capitalism.
Gotcha. You just touched on a subject that I think is really interesting in this larger conversation around building a base and coalitions, and that's the role of immigration and socialism and how that feeds into the construction of the base and the larger organization. European immigration during the late 19th and early 20th century fed into the birth of both the Communist Party as well as the base of the socialists. I was wondering what your thoughts were on that topic.
Well, not so different from otherwise. There's a conflict in the Italian community, certainly up to 1950, or maybe up to 1942, between fascists on the one side, quite open fascists on the one side, and the left, the anti-fascists, on the other side. And Luigi Nardella, who was a barber, who also was the fixture in the Communist Party from 1922 until 1982. He said to crowds, he would stand on a stepladder, and the fascists had someone who stood on a stepladder on Saturdays, I guess, in Federal Hill, and the crowds that came to hear them were more or less the same in number. It may even be in the same in demography, although you would think the supporters of fascism were more businessmen and the supporters of anti-fascism were more working people. But most definitely, except for the issue of Sacco Vanzetti, when they all supported the martyrs, the divisions were within ethnic groups. Here's another wonderful example to get away from the left as such. There was a leading furniture dealer, son of the most prestigious furniture dealer in Providence on North Main Street, quite a fashionable store that closed in recent decades. The son led a campaign for the end of racial discrimination in housing. And I was told he was drummed out of business circles in the Jewish world of Rhode Island because there were a lot of landlords and or people connected with landlords, and they knew if an anti-discrimination measure went through, it would cost them money. Discrimination was something that raised rents in certain areas, especially poor areas where they had extensive holdings. So that to take this left of center opinion and to fight for it meant that other members of the same ethnic group would come at you tooth and claw.
Gotcha. One of the novel things that came out of your scholarship originally was this insight that was contrary to the things that had gone before about the role of the religious left and quote-unquote utopian socialism. And in circles that I travel in today, there's still a little bit of skepticism and antagonism towards religion, but there also doesn't seem to be a recognition that while the secular left can get caught up in a lot of the same patterns of behavior around the political alliance stuff, you have groups like Catholic Workers and the Quakers really going gangbusters over the past 10 years in the anti-war movement.
Yeah.
And I was wondering what you think.
I experienced less of the. I've experienced the last 10 years not at all, so I can't speak about that effectively. The incredibly reactionary Catholic Church was less effective or even interested in red baiting, destroying unions, and so forth in Rhode Island because there were so few Reds. The schools of Catholicism to attack communists and unions, they really didn't play a role in Rhode Island, unlike Massachusetts, Connecticut, and other places. But the church itself was by and large very reactionary, especially from the 1960s onward until now, with one remarkable exception, and that is the great boycott, the campaign to support Cesar Chavez. Somehow or other, the supporters of Chavez managed to make a dent, even against the will of the hierarchy, and rally people for some significant recognition of the plight of the very Catholic Mexican Americans working in the fields. And there's one more exception. In the 1980s, during the wars in Central America, I think 4 nuns were murdered by right-wing forces in El Salvador. And at least one of those nuns lived just across the border in Massachusetts. So there was a real success, if temporary, in Rhode Island to dramatize the case of nuns being murdered by people supported by the Reagan administration, but also supported by Albert Shanker and the right wing of the Democratic Party and their control of unions. So that was a significant dent. By the time I had students going out in the 90s and interviewing older radical priests and nuns, there certainly were some that were still around, but they were, so to speak, all on notice, under guard because of the wide repression within the church. That may have eased in the time since around issues of poverty, or it may not have, and I wouldn't necessarily know what the significance of that was. And I also don't know what the significance of progressive Catholicism is within the immigrants from the Dominican Republic, since that would be central in developments in Providence, and it would be important in elections and a whole host of other issues. Is it at all a Catholic thing for Dominican immigrants, or is it not at all? And is there the old divide between religious people who are conservative business people and progressives who are by and large are secular? That's a good question. Quakers have always had a following on College Hill. Traditionally, that's their strength, and it may well be that they managed to gather in larger numbers. And likewise, has been a peace force among Jewish progressives, and I was part of that peace force, even as someone raised as a Protestant. But it tended to appear and disappear. As an older lady said to me about the avant-garde in Rhode Island, if you're in the avant-garde, then you don't stay within the mainstream of the Jewish community. If you're on the left, then you don't stay within the mainstream of the Jewish community. I would say that probably is an accurate statement, because business is always the most powerful force in any community. And that's as much as I can tell you on these questions.
Gotcha. Do you have any thoughts about on-the-ground organizing methods and like the things that were done that led to successful campaigns in the past?
Part of the problem is deeply historic now, because the effective methods in immigrant neighborhoods would not be quite the same from generation to generation. Likewise, anti-poverty organizing in black communities by community organizers would be distinct and something that I rarely saw at close range. But I think that the impending sense of crisis is likely to bring mass campaigns of the unemployed for both more jobs, but also for some taxation of the wealthy and pressures upon City Hall and upon the State House. And that does sort of remind us of the 1930s, where even a governor who cleverly, at the time of the 1934 general textile strike, announced that all communists in the state would be arrested. Very few workers, mostly merchants, Armenian and Jewish. And then once they had been arrested, announced the communist danger was over, and now unions could be organized legally and safely. That was a classic, clever move by a Democratic governor. And one wouldn't be surprised to see something like that happen again. Of course, there are no communists that anybody can find very easily, and maybe they don't seem to be dangerous anymore. But somehow it's necessary for even the most corrupt public officials in a moment of crisis to justify something being done about it. What that will be, we don't know, but whatever it is, it may legitimate left-wing organizing.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, I just saw it in the email that I get from the CPUSA conversation about restarting unemployment councils.
I saw the same thing, and I think it is certainly going to happen, whether they're called councils, whatever they are. It strikes me as inevitable, but it also calls for some very skilled organizing and dedicated organizing. And boy, did they have it in 1932, socialists as well as communists. And we need people of that caliber now.
Right. There's probably some listeners that don't know what the unemployment councils were, so do you have any thoughts on those?
There were unemployed leagues and unemployment councils. And the first effort by communists was an expectation that a revolution was around the corner, and they would sort of march on City Hall and be beaten back by the police and carry red flags and so forth. And then they realized that was a mistake, that they wanted to achieve concrete results for people. And after a few years of massive organizing and trying to find slogans that had a wide appeal, then they turned to negotiations with the government at various levels. And some of the people who've been communist organizers and rent strikers turned into be lower level public officials or aides to public officials, forcing landlords to change their policies and passing bills in the state legislature, especially in New York, to ease conditions. But I guess I'd also say that one of the greatest things that happened in the 1929 to 34 period was rent strikes. It's most definitely the case that people are going to be thrown out of their apartments, and what communists did, others too, but mainly communists, was to forcibly move the furniture back in, and in effect to dare the landlord to call a police who really didn't want to take action within the neighborhood of that kind and arrest everybody. And there's no reason why that shouldn't happen now when all the rent comes due.
Gotcha. Okay. Are there any other?
But it will take squads of people who are willing to do that. They used to say the most common quip in the black neighborhood was a black woman saying, "Johnny, go get a red."
Yeah.
Because somebody had to do that, and it was most likely in New York or Chicago or Boston. It was most likely to be a dedicated communist.
Mm. And simultaneous with all this, we're also seeing these rather, I guess you could call it, sickening and disturbing absurdities.
Indeed, and it's often been pointed out, especially by historians like David Montgomery, that the Black Legions and the dark forces within the American Legion were much larger than the Communist Party and Socialist Party together, whereas they were very badly organized. And the Ku Klux Klan fell apart because it was a big Ponzi scheme of selling people the branded robes and the caps and so forth, that it just fell apart in itself economically. But they're very large, they're often armed, they're dangerous, and they're ruthless, and they're on the streets again.
Right.
And the only thing that really can be done is to offer peaceful resistance, but also to enlist the authorities not to allow them to do violent things, and to organize some of the people who mistakenly support them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Do you have any thoughts on what established unions were doing during these economic times of hardship?
I got 5 more minutes now, then I have to get back to things. Unions of craft workers were intent upon keeping themselves safe. And they actually, in the early 30s, inclined toward the creation of a labor party. But by and large, they were exclusionary unions, white males only, and they were trying to hold on to their privileges and inclined to support progressive things, but very nervous about them as well. There were a lot of exceptions, but that would be the rule. The unions, often new unions, often unsuccessful unions of low-skilled workers, were very frequently led or influenced by the left, and they had very wide social programs, including connections with the community. When they were successful, they had connections with the community. When they didn't have connections with the community, then they were unsuccessful. So one would expect unionized, so-called privileged sectors to be the last to respond, but there would have to be exceptions as well.
Gotcha. Are there any thoughts you'd like to bring up in closing?
Simply that with the crisis that we face is unprecedented, but it does remind us very much of the 1930s. And what characterizes Rhode Island is not has been, I won't say in the future, is not a giant political breakthrough, but a mobilization, a very significant mobilization from below, with the sense that the rich and powerful should not be allowed to get away with what they've gotten away with so far.
Gotcha. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show.
Next up, Kollibri terre Sonnenblume, host of Voices for Nature and Peace podcast.
You have written a book. It's a radical take on food production and agriculture called The Failure of Farming and the Necessity of Wild Tending. You have experience as a farmer personally, and so I was wondering first what your thoughts are on the situation we find ourselves in because of COVID around agriculture, food production, food supply chains, those things.
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. Well, COVID is doing the same thing to the agricultural system that it's doing to many of our other systems, which is showing us their weaknesses, And when it comes to the agricultural system in the United States, one of its weaknesses is that it is dominated by a small number of monopolistic players who, for being so large, are not very agile, I guess you could say. They're not able to respond to changes very easily because they're such large large institutions. There's like kind of an inertia that exists behind large institutions. Like they're the same way, I guess you could talk about how a large ship takes a very long time to turn,
Right.
It's the same thing with these big institutions, right? So you have something happen like happened this spring where suddenly demand falls for, produce, for example, because of a lot of restaurants closing and because of schools closing and this and that. And so one thing, they suddenly had all this, quote, extra produce on their hands. They didn't know what to do with it. And so they just destroyed it, There's pictures of them digging these big ditches and just burying, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of onions. And it wasn't just produce, it was also animals, unfortunately, from animal agriculture. So there was these stories we heard about how, now we have to kill these 8,000 pigs, now we have to kill these 12,000 chickens or whatever. And that's because the system is so big that things have to keep moving through it. And if it gets stuck like that, the only thing that they could do was destroy it. I mean, this is what they said. Of course, the only thing, meaning the only thing they could do within the realm of capitalism, within the realm of profit and this and that. Because, of course, at the same time that you had all this food that there was no market demand for, in that sense of paying customers, you had a lot of people who are suddenly not working, who are lining up at food banks, etc., who could use the food. And so it showed us once again just how perverse the capitalist system is, especially this monopoly capitalism we have here.
Gotcha. So explain to me the contradiction or the distinction between farming as opposed to wild tending that you're pointing out in your title.
Right. Okay. That's a completely different subject. And so a lot of people talk about the agricultural revolution, the farming revolution when people started to farm. And before that, people were hunter-gatherers, or it might more accurately be said gatherer-hunters, because they actually, in many cases, relied more upon the food that they were gathering than the food that they were hunting. So the agricultural revolution that we hear the most about here in the West is the one that occurred in the Middle East around 10,000 years ago. And so what happened was that there was a transition from that happened over the course of several thousand years or a few thousand years, where we went from being nomadic people who were planting and harvesting as we went seasonally on like seasonal migrations to becoming a people who were sedentary and who were planting everything in one place. So agriculture is where you're no longer following you're no longer moving across the landscape as the seasons change, following what it is that's in season in different places, but now you're staying in one place. So with agriculture, a lot of social changes happened as well. That's when we had property. People had their own property before in the sense of this is my digging stick, right? Or, this is my spear, but not property in the sense of this is my land. That had not happened before. That was a new thing. Cities also came about at the same time because you had a surplus now, a stored surplus that was happening. Stored surplus is also something that goes along with agriculture, at least at that scale. Massive irrigation projects. Slavery came about at this point in order to have people to work all of those fields. And this is also when patriarchy emerged. So there's a big shift that happened when we went from being migrant people to being sedentary people. And all over the world, this transition happened at different times. It happened in uneven ways. There are places in history where people started farming and then backed off of it and went back to a more migratory lifestyle. This actually happened in North America. You might have heard of Cahokia and some of the mound cities that existed in the Midwest in the United States in the Mississippi Valley before Europeans came. And a lot of these were abandoned, and they actually had a more agricultural society and then returned to a more migrant society. There were still people living this migratory life in the Western United States up through the 1800s and even the early 1900s in some places. And it's mostly been suppressed or wiped out at this point, although there's a small number of people who are trying to keep it alive, both people of indigenous background and people from the colonizer background. And so in the book, I had come into contact with different people who were trying to bring these skills back and bring these lifeways back of the wild tending. And so the book is contrasting agriculture and wild tending, showing how agriculture is fundamentally unsustainable and how wild tending, it is sustainable because it worked for at least 100,000 years.
Right. And I think that also speaks to a lot of the other systemic shortcomings that have been revealed by COVID and that lifestyle that comes out of having stay in one place food production systems, right?
Yeah, at this point, we have those systems in place. At this point, to make a transition away from it would be tricky, not impossible, but we couldn't do it overnight,
Gotcha.
And so, at the moment, our best step would be to step our agricultural systems down from being these huge, monolithic, monopolistic things into being at least small scale and localized, on our way back to something that's more sustainable. Even small scale agriculture, there are problems with staying on the same piece of land and working it over and over again.
Okay. One of the chapters in your book is titled The Urban Farming Fantasy, and I think that's pretty interesting to discuss because, especially in springtime, there was a moment where people who either for desperate or maybe just idealistic reasons were thinking, well, I'll grow a tomato garden and that will be my food supply for the summer.
Right.
So what's your take on urban farming?
Well, my take on urban farming is that we have to try it and that we have to implement it to the most serious degree that we possibly can. And I was involved in such an experiment when I lived in Portland, Oregon, from around 2005 to 2010. And I ran a CSA, that's a community supported agriculture, where customers pay a farmer a lump sum in the spring, and then they get fresh produce on a regular basis, usually once a week, throughout the summer into the fall. It depends on what the timeline is from farmer to farmer. So I actually made a living that way in Portland, and I had 30-some different plots around the city, just all kind of small ones, that I would tend and collect everything from, every week and give to people. And this was the experiment that I had where I really looked at these questions very seriously about urban farming, and not only the logistical aspects of it, which are their own challenge, but the social aspects of it, And so the logistical aspects of farming in the city, there's advantages and disadvantages. I mean, if you're trying to farm in the city, one thing that isn't as much of a problem as it is in the country are insect pests, for example, So any of the times I've farmed in the countryside, I've had problems with insect pests that I never had in the city, because there's just larger populations of insects in the country, and the rural landscape is very much out of balance, especially when it comes to predator-prey relationships and when it comes to insects, And so, like this spring, for example, I had, these blister beetles appear where I am, and they ate they destroyed like nearly half of my potato crop, I never had anything like that happen in the city, because the city is so fragmented and it is broken up into so many small pieces that it doesn't actually support these large, sort of pestilence scale insect populations like that. Also, the city, believe it or not, is in most cases less polluted in certain ways than the rural areas are. So if you go out to an agricultural area in around one of the cities, anywhere in the United States, there's terrible chemicals that most farmers are using on their land. The fertilizers, the pesticides, the herbicides, all the different things that are going on. The fungicides, which are the worst ones. And a lot of these chemicals are actually illegal to use in the city. So you're not allowed to use atrazine in the city, for example. Like, you can use that in the country, though, and that's like, that's one of the ones that can cause like genetic damage. I mean, there's really bad chemicals that have been used in the country, and there's places where people are still farming, but the land is so incredibly worn out, So that's another advantage of being in the city, is that it's actually not as poisoned, And because of all the buildings and all of that, it's somewhat moderated against extremes in temperatures as well, So you have like all of that pavement, all those buildings, that's all a heat sink. During the day, those heat up. During the night, they release that heat. And so there's not as much of a difference between night and day temperatures in the city. So those are all reasons why it's great to try it, there. And then reasons why it's hard is because people just they're not yet anyway, they're not interested in having yards that aren't lawns yet. Everyone still wants everything to look pretty. Everybody still wants their little property to be their own version of Versailles, And so, farming is kind of messy. It doesn't really look super tidy. If it looks really tidy, that means that the farmer's kind of wasting their time, that they're not doing the other things they should be doing, because there's weeds, plants just don't always grow in their row the way they're supposed to. I mean, this was one of the biggest problems that we had, was that people were not interested yet in how it all looks different, and especially if you want to let your vegetables go to seed and collect the seed. And of course, seed saving and collecting, this is an ancient practice that goes back before farming to wild tending. People were seed saving then as well and collecting seeds then. So we've been doing that for, 1,000 years at least. And, you let a plant go to seed in the city and people freak out, because it just looks like a weed or this or that. I mean, you've heard that term, going to seed, you know? that's considered a bad thing, you know? Well, that's actually just a natural process, but that's something that people didn't want to see. And so we found that it was hard to farm in the city for that reason. Now, there's also other reasons coming up now, too, and that most of the cities have become so gentrified at this point. And so all of the land in the city is now so valuable that, people don't want to set it aside for gardening. They want to build another little skinny house there or a condo or whatever on it, and so, we started about 40 gardens altogether during the time I was in Portland. And at this point, 10 years later, there's only 2 of those that are still actually being gardened as gardens. And the rest of them went back to lawn or got built on or different things. And so there wasn't really a commitment to it,
Oh, wow.
And then the only one other thing I want to mention about urban farming is that when people say, oh, I'm going to grow all my food, they're not really looking in their cupboards and being honest with themselves about what they're eating, Like, I like that you said tomato garden. Well, because, obviously you can't live off of tomatoes, and that's the first thing that most people think of when they want to plant a vegetable garden, I mean, so if you look at tomatoes, like, well, people will eat tomatoes, like what, on a sandwich, on a pizza, or something like that. Well, that's wheat there, or some other kind of grain,
Mm-hmm.
So most people don't look at or pasta, right, which is another grain. People don't look at their diet and realize, oh, the majority of the U.S. American diet, in most cases, is, 75, 80, 85% grains and beans. Staple crops is what we would call those, and we could throw meat into that category too. And only 15 to 20% of our diet is actually the vegetables and fruits that we would grow in our gardens or that we would have on fruit trees in our yards. And so not many people are willing to eat only vegetables or fruits, and it's actually hard to put together a diet that's only vegetables and fruits that's going to keep you going, as well, just calorically. So where is the wheat going to come from, just as an example, or the oats or the whatever, rice, I mean, lots of people eat rice. Are they going to grow rice in their backyard? So these are the things that people weren't thinking about.
Gotcha. One of the kind of variables that jumps up at me, and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about, is the role that urban agriculture might play in remediating brownfields and other pollution spots. Is there any potential there, or is it a much more complicated situation?
There is potential for that kind of thing there, and that's an intriguing question. There's a lot of permaculture people who are looking into that, and I've only ever been on the edge of those things. And so, just quickly, the 2 things I would mention is that people have talked about doing remediation of petroleum products from soil with mushrooms. And supposedly the mushrooms are breaking things down in such a way that you can still eat them then. So that's a very interesting. People have been experimenting with oyster mushrooms with that. So that's intriguing. And then people have been experimenting with getting heavy metals out of soils by growing sunflowers, because sunflowers are a plant that will uptake the heavy metals. And there's other plants too that are accumulators like that, but sunflower is really well known. In the case of the sunflower picking up the heavy metals, you then have the case of like, okay, well, now what do I do with the sunflower? Because if you just let them die on site and then compost back, well, the heavy metals are still there. Heavy metals don't compost, so
right.
Heavy metals were kind of that's a tricky one. They've got to go somewhere.
Right. What are some kinds of best practices, or maybe your own personal philosophy you take as people begin gardening over the course of the summer that you would share or suggest?
Like just sort of general things, you mean?
Yeah, I mean, hobby gardeners, people who
Right.
are looking at, there's kind of an uptick now because of COVID and interest in farming and hobby gardening and that sort of thing.
Yeah, which is great to see, because everyone should be practicing. So I think that one thing to do would be try to grow. One way to go about it anyway is to try to grow a variety of things, like not only a variety of different vegetables, but a variety of different varieties of each of the vegetables that you like. because from year to year, it's going to be different what's going to do well, you know? And this is one thing that's happening more and more that experienced gardeners and farmers are noticing, is that every year is just different now. Like, things are becoming chaotic. You can't count on the same patterns of weather and seasons, precipitation and temperature, et cetera, being what they were before. So in order to address that, one thing to do is to plant a lot of different things. And this year, maybe your tomatoes do great and your cabbages do terrible. But next year, your cabbages do great and your tomatoes do terrible, because it'll just depend on what kind of year it is. So there's that. That's important, is to try a variety of things. I would say for people who are very much beginners, one thing to try that might make it interesting for them is, what's one of their very favorite things to eat that can grow in their area, and work on that, because they already know they like that. They know what a good example of that is like, and maybe that will help to, that it's one of their favorite things to eat. Maybe that will help to motivate them, And then the other thing I would say is that as many people as possible should save seed as well. And because if you plant seeds from a packet, that you buy online, in the ground, not all of them come up. Only some of them will come up, and maybe most of them come up. But that's your first selection right there. We talk about selection when we talk about saving seeds. So you're selecting for different traits. And so the first selection has already occurred when you plant the seeds, and some of them come up and some of them don't. That selection was for the seeds that will come up in your area. Okay, great. Then you can, then you grow those, and over the course of the season, some of them don't do so well, some of them do well. So by the end of the season, you at least now have, these are plants that will, make it in my bioregion, wherever it is that I am. And so that's worth saving there, and saving seeds and then exchanging them with friends, and neighbors in the same area is a really good idea to do. And also, just saving seeds helps you to understand the plant better, and how it is that it grows and what it is that it wants. If you let the plant go to seed and collect some of the seed, but don't collect all the seed, let some of the seed fall down to the ground, you'll then find out when that plant's going to come up by itself when given the chance. So gardeners often talk about volunteers, Oh, I had some squash here last year, and here's a volunteer that came up because they missed a squash and it rotted out in the field. There's the seeds out there, so they sat there over the winter. Some of them came up in the spring. That's a volunteer. Well, the volunteers will tell us something about timing in that area. So people in your area might be like, oh, plant this vegetable at this time of year. Well, if you let the seeds go and volunteer, you might find out that, like, oh, actually they'll come up earlier than people have been saying, or et cetera, so you learn something that way. I learned a lot. That was one of my best learning tools when I was in Oregon. Learning when to seed things was to let things come up on their own from self-sown seeds, because the plant, of course, has its own senses and its own intelligence as to when it's best for it to come up. It knows better than we do, is one way of saying that.
Gotcha. And one of the interesting things about both this book and your further writings is that you bring to this set of topics an anti-colonial, post-colonial lens. You've got a chapter in here called Decolonizing the Western Worldview, and it's impossible to deny the fact that things related to agriculture in America have always included, unfortunately, this settler colonial framework. And I'm wondering what your just general opinions are on that matter.
Yeah, right. I mean, that's so important, because here in the United States, this is what we're dealing with when we're dealing with virtually every aspect of our culture here, is we're dealing with the fact that we are settler colonialists here, and how that impacts the people here, how that impacts the ecosystems, how that impacts us. I mean, that's, it's central to looking at everything about our lives here. But agriculture certainly gives us a very clear and direct window into that, So, I've traveled around the United States a lot, and one thing that and I've always been interested in plants. Even before I was a farmer, I was raised by gardeners, and my grandparents on both sides and further back were actually all farmers. I come from an agricultural family, I guess you could say. So anyway, it's in my blood in some way. And so as I've traveled, I've always noticed the different things that people are doing for gardens and farms in different areas. And one thing I always thought when I was in desert places was like, man, people are so stupid trying to farm and garden here. This just doesn't make any sense. It's really a lot of work, like the vast farms that they have around the Salton Sea and the desert in Imperial County, in Southern California, or the orchards that they have in the desert in Phoenix. I mean, not in Arizona on the way to Phoenix from where I am, which are all fed by the Colorado River or by draining aquifers or et cetera. I mean, these are these harsh landscapes where it's really hard to grow these things. And this year, just because of circumstance and because where I happen to be when all this hit, I'm actually in a desert area. It's desert grassland is the ecotype that I'm in. And here I am trying to garden and farm. And I'm like, yeah, I was right. This is really stupid to try to do this here because it's just this is what settler colonialism does, is it says, oh, here's my crops, here's the way I eat, now I'm going to take and I'm just going to impose this wherever I am, whether it makes any sense or not, And, it doesn't really make much sense to impose these crops and these ways of doing things on the area that I'm in here, this is unceded Apache territory. So there were some things that they grew here that we would consider vegetable or farm crops. They did grow corn and squash and beans here, but they were different squash and corn and beans than we grow. They had their own varieties here. Some of these I've been trying to find and trying to grow here. But then a lot of the things that we like to grow in our gardens, they won't grow here at all. There's not any way of making it happen, really. I mean, this is an area that has less than 15 inches of precipitation a year. And at this time of year, it hasn't rained, maybe it's rained twice in the last 4 months. And humidity gets down into the low teens during the day. So it's just, it's a tremendously arid and kind of extreme environment. And so for us to be bringing our farming here, it's really ridiculous. And the big thing in this area is ranching. So most of the irrigation around here is used for irrigating pastures. And then they've got all these cows out there. And, the cows, this is not the kind of area that they evolved in either. They, evolved in wetland areas in, Central Europe or whatever, but it's very different, So here they are imposed on the landscape. So all this imposition on the landscape, destroys or degrades everything that was living here before, including all of the native wild food crops that indigenous people would have depended on before, and endangers them, and then it's not as though we're able to get a lot of production out of the area anyway, so it's sort of doubly terrible. Then you look at some place like the Midwest of the United States where that was all, prairie, and, there's actually a lower percentage of pristine virgin prairie left in the United States than there is old growth forest. So as an ecosystem type, prairie is even more rare than old growth forest. And old growth forest is less than 10% left. It's 2 or 3% left of original prairie. All that's now being grown for, corn and for soybeans, but only a small percentage of that's actually being grown directly for human consumption. Most of that's being grown as animal feed for the giant confined animal farming operations, or for so-called biofuels, for the ethanol. So something like 60% of what we're doing there in the middle, where, we pushed out the Indians, we stole their land, killed all of the buffalo, that's what they depended on, and then we go in there and we're not even planting food there, we're just doing this nonsense. So it's just The more you look at it, the more unnatural it all starts to feel.
Gotcha. Are there any other points you'd like to bring up in closing on any topic of your thought?
I would say that the thing that's been on my mind the most the last few days, just in relation to all these things, to COVID again, and to the settler colonialism, is just how the settler colonialism, it becomes this, it blinds us. It's in order to ignore the fact that all of this land is stolen and that some enormous amount of our wealth was built up on slavery. We have to ignore our history. We have to ignore how we got here, and then we have to ignore the fact that we're enjoying things that are here only through those thefts, And so we've become a very delusional people. And in addition to being a delusional people, we're also a very mean-spirited people, Mm-hmm. And so we're seeing that come out now with these, with these ridiculous, conspiracy theories, which are, trying to deny that the pandemic even exists, or trying to deny that common sense responses to it, such as wearing a mask, trying to deny that those work, And so it feels at the moment as though COVID has the possibility to be a straw that breaks the camel's back event for the United States. And we've been in decline here in a lot of ways for many years. And that decline has been getting more rapid, wages as compared to inflation have been in decline since the early 70s by one way of measuring things, right? And then in the last 20 years, the inequality has really also steepened. So we've been an empire in decline for a while, but wow, this one looks likely to break us because we now have, I guess, 50 million people have applied for unemployment. Those jobs aren't going to be coming back. So we're now in this place of everything's falling apart. We need to be collective in some way in order to make the best of the situation. And yet being collective is sort of the opposite of what settler colonialism is about, because that's all about individualism and greed, not cooperation, Mm-hmm. So it's these are challenging times we're in, Andrew.
Thanks for listening, and be sure to tune in next week. This is the Washington Babylon Podcast, hosted by Ken Silverstein and produced by Andrew Stewart.